Hello, everybody, and welcome to another wonderful episode of The Best Games, period. I'm your host, Jack Gardner, and I have to admit, today is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and I didn't record anything, Naomi didn't record anything, and so we're just kind of left on a Monday without any episode to go out. And that's just unacceptable. So I am here and recording for you. I'm also live streaming this, so you can check those out. We've been a bit infrequent about live streaming just because our schedules have been so chaotic that we haven't been able to stick to any coherent schedule, which I know is kind of important for that whole streaming thing to work out. So we're going to try and be better about that in the future, especially for our lovely patrons on patreon.com/bestgamesperiod, who they get to watch in live. And occasionally when occasionally when there's a mess up episode like this one, we go live for everybody, which is the case right now. So, that's great. We're good. How are you? And you might notice that I'm the only one talking. That's because Naomi isn't with me today. She's off and busy and saving the world of video games, probably. And instead, we did something kind of like this a while back where I had played through the awesome adventures of Captain Spirit and wanted to talk about it, and so we just kind of got on mic and talked about it until I was done, and that was kind of just like a fun little thing to put out there. This is kind of along the same lines where it's not really an honorable mention, it's more just me spouting some waffle at you. As the kids say these days, I'm definitely not out of touch. So, yes. So I took to Twitter and I asked through the Best Games Period Twitter account, twitter.com. You can find us at Best Games Period. I'm just putting all the plugs up in the beginning of the episode here. This is great. But I put all of that out on Twitter and was just like, hey, what do you want to hear me talk about? Because there's a bunch of things going on in the world of video games. There was just a insane stream going on from H-Bomber Guy, he's a prominent YouTuber. He makes a lot of thoughtful and insightful videos about various issues. His most recent video was about flat earth theory and debunking it, and that was pretty interesting. But he decided that because this older comedian had in the UK had essentially raised this question about this prominent children's charity that helps trans youth, called Mermaids, they lost their government funding, I guess. And so H-Bomber Guy decided that he would have this stream of him playing Donkey Kong 64 until he was done. And it turns out that I guess a lot of people like trans folks, which was really that was really heartwarming for me as a trans person. And so they ended up raising $340,000 for that by playing Donkey Kong 64. And that's just more evidence that we live in the most bizarre timeline, but for once, it's actually a good thing instead of something awful and terrible. So, anyway, that happened, and it was just crazy to even be in that orbit of people. Friend of the show, Foldable Human on Twitter, Dan Olson, he was on the stream, just hanging out with the H-Bomber guy, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was on the stream, which is crazy. John Romero, just all kinds of people were on that I was going to say podcast, but live stream, and it was really, really awesome. And I kind of went into that a little bit on Twitter, just why something that on its face seems so silly can actually mean a whole heck of a lot to a lot of people. And so, yeah, that was a good part of the weekend. And of course, the other good part was Ace Combat 7, which just came out, and it is just so much fun and so gosh darn pretty, and I will probably be talking about that in a little bit. But I took to Twitter and asked what you all wanted to hear about, and one of the responses was really good. It's from a friend of the show, Golden Corsair, who frequently watches these live streams, so shout out to Golden Corsair, and we really appreciate when people take the time out of their day to interact with us on Twitter. It's really refreshing, and it just kind of gives some faces to the people who listen out there. I know sometimes I look at our analytics for the show, and I'm like, there's clearly like one person in New Zealand who listens to our show. Who is that person? What do they like about it? It's just interesting to me. Anyway, Golden Corsair dropped by our Twitter account and stated that he wanted to see me talk about my most anticipated titles of 2019, which is a great topic. I went into this quite a bit with Marcus Stewart. He's just launching a new podcast called Marcus Talks About Games, and I'm a guest on the first 2 episodes of it, where we talk about a bunch of upcoming games and kind of what's going on with them and what makes them interesting, and it was a lot of fun. We recorded for such a long time. I'm not shocked that it's in 2 episodes. So that being said, you can hear a lot of what I might talk about is kind of repeating it, but there are a few games that Marcus wanted to talk about that I didn't know a whole lot about, and there were some games that we just didn't have time to talk about because we recorded for like 5 hours and we had to stop. So with all of that in mind, I'm going to talk about some of the games that I'm really looking forward to in 2019. Some of them you might expect, and others of them you might not probably expect. And I mentioned this earlier, but it wasn't while I was recording, but I'm a little bit sick, so if you hear me sniffle, or if you hear me cough or sneeze, or if my voice sounds a little bit weird, that would be why. I'm going to be going over some of the most anticipated games of 2019, at least for me, and some of them you might have heard of before, and others of them you might not have heard before. So let's approach those with an open mind. On top of that, if there's time, one of the other requests we received from Pixie Park Kent on Twitter is a top 5 list of games that inspired me to get into games journalism or games critique or whatever you want to call this strange niche I find myself writing in. And I think those are 2 really good suggestions. So, without further ado, let's just hop right into it, because that I can do that on a show where it's just me. That's pretty interesting, isn't it, how that works out? So I made a list of games that aren't necessarily, I mean, some of them are going to surprise you for 2019, others of them not so much, and I'm just going to go through them. It's not even like a good numbered list. I didn't like get the top 10 games I'm most excited for, or something like that. I think it's, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. 15 games that I'm excited for. And basically they don't follow any order. So I'm just excited for them to exist. The first one is kind of a no-brainer because it was one of my best games of 2018 and it's not done yet. Life is Strange 2. I really, really want to see where that story goes. It's, I'm not going to go into spoiler territory, but it seems to have set itself up as a road trip across a large cross section of America for these two kids, and it's really the first episode really put a lot of my faith into it. I wasn't necessarily ready to be sold on it, but by the time I saw the credits roll on the first episode, I knew it was something special, and the team at Don't Nod that is working on it, they clearly know what they're doing. Or at least it really feels like they do in that first episode, and maybe that will change as the episodes continue to come out and like the overall narrative becomes clearer. But for now, super excited to see the rest of those come out throughout the year. And it's just a matter of waiting for those sweet episodes. And it's kind of, there's a part of it that's kind of nice and nostalgic for the days when I eagerly awaited every new Walking Dead episode or the Wolf Among Us episode from Telltale. Rest in peace, a Rooney. Telltale. All right, and now this is one that I actually hadn't heard of until very recently. And that is the 4X strategy title At the Gates, which actually releases in 2 days. So it's really coming up there, and it's coming out on PC, and it's, well, I think all you really need to know about it is that it's designed by the lead designer of Civilization 5, man by the name of John Schaefer. Basically spent the last 6 or 7 years developing this game, and it's finally coming out. And he had actually a really interesting piece, I think, for The Escapist that talked about his struggles with addiction while making the game, and it's just really... It sounds really interesting. It basically takes a similar premise to something like Civilization 5, and then makes a bunch of design decisions that unbalance the game. And it can do that because it's not really intended for multiplayer play. When you're making a multiplayer game, you have to plan for everyone to have a roughly equal starting position, a field of play, and for this game it's entirely single player, and so they don't do that. Instead, they replace the multiplayer element with a bunch of roguelike elements, which is really interesting. So you might start with just a horrible starting position, and you'll encounter random events that can change the course of your civilization. There's a seasonal calendar, and so if you don't manage your empire quite right, it can fall into chaos during the cold months. Alternatively, winter opens up a ton of possibilities because you can use rivers as roads and all kinds of little interesting tactical choices, which I appreciate as a very much a low-key strategy gamer. I've put ungodly amounts of time into at least Civilization 4 and 5, and I'm pretty sure most people who've listened to the show for a while know that I have an undying love for Stellaris. So this game's right up my alley, especially because I tend to play those games solo anyway. And so a solo-oriented game like that is really interesting to me. And on top of that, the game is set during the time period where the Roman Empire was kind of on its last legs, on the verge of collapse, and you play as one of these tiny kingdoms that is springing up around the fringes of the Roman Empire, and your goal is to build the largest civilization you can, and the most prosperous and successful one. And part of that means taking on the remnants of the Roman Empire, which, even in their kind of decrepit state, are still pretty imposing and threatening. So I love that concept. I actually studied that quite a bit in my college days. I minored in medieval history, and it's that minor kind of starts with the fall of the Roman Empire, which is kind of fun. They call it the Dark Ages because suddenly everything got really dark for some reason. And fun fact, the Dark Ages are largely like a weird myth that we project back onto the past. Like things were still happening in the Dark Ages. Really interesting and important social developments. They just weren't necessarily in Europe. There's a lot of stuff on the other side of the Mediterranean in northern Africa and especially over in the Middle East that was super interesting and a big deal. Not to mention that for basically everything that was going on in Europe, China and Japan and all the Southeast Asian countries were really having their own super interesting historical events going on and making their own innovations and progressions. And I think oftentimes we forget a lot about that. I'm kind of going off on this tangent that has nothing really to do with At the Gates because it's very much a European-centric civilization game. And I don't mean that as Civilization branded. It's an independent game. The first game from John Schaefer's studio. So I'm just really excited to check that out. I think it'll be at the very least, an interesting game. On that note, another game that's coming up really soon, Resident Evil 2. I have never actually played Resident Evil 2, and I'm really looking forward to this remake to come out because it looks gorgeous and it looks fun, and I'm only familiar with a smattering of details from this game, so it will basically be like me playing it for the first time. And I'm really looking forward to that, and once I finish it, then we're going to have an episode with Kazuma Oh gosh, I'm forgetting his name. No, I'm sorry, Kaz. No. What's your last name? Okay, I didn't want to I wanted to make sure I got the last name right. Kazuma Hashimoto, who has been on the show several times to talk about stuff like Resident Evil 4, and I believe and Catherine. That's right, one of my all-time favorite episodes that we have ever recorded. Check out that Catherine episode. Lots of good stuff. But he's going to come on the show again, and we're going to talk about Resident Evil 2. And I'm looking forward to that because he's just delightful. On to the next game, Metro Exodus, which if you haven't played any of the Metro games, you are missing out on a really unique experience. And I have purposely kept myself in the dark about a lot of details related to Metro Exodus. I'm excited for a more open world approach to the game, though I'm also a little worried that it might take away a little bit from kind of what makes that series so good and the encounters so tense, because they are so focused and well constructed. But that being said, like both Metro games, phenomenal. Buy the HD remasters. They are very much worth your time. Very interesting and fun. And I love the concept of using bullets as currency. It's such a good mechanic to have in your game. And I know why most other games don't do it, but man, the tension of knowing that you need bullets to like upgrade your guns and wanting to conserve ammunition, but also getting into a fight where you know you need to like go all out or else you're just done. It's great. It's great and I love it. Left Alive is one of the more low-key titles that I haven't really seen a ton of buzz about. And also, I don't know a lot about it. I know it's set in the Front Mission universe of Square Enix games. And it's a game developed and published by Square Enix. Which, it's interesting that... Oh my gosh. I'm sorry, my nose is just going ballistic right now. Whew. Alright. So, Left Alive is basically this action... I don't even know what it is, really. All I know is that they have it's set in Front Mission, which I've never played any of those games, but they look interesting and cool. And they also got one of the artists that used to be attached to Metal Gear to work on the game, and so it just looks really interesting and good, and I'm excited for it. Look, the prompt was, what am I really looking forward to? It didn't specify it had to be for good reasons. So, Left Alive, I'm into it. I could eventually like drift away and it might not be super interesting, but for now I'm into it. Of course I have to check out Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice. I love the Dark Souls games. I love action games in general. I'm not sure how the departure from an action RPG is going to translate, but it looks really interesting, and as someone who wasn't a huge fan of Nioh, I'm looking forward to a similar world done in a more authentic, From Software way, and mixing that with just pure, straightforward action. Because honestly, one of my least favorite aspects of Nioh was the loot system, and just ditching that entirely makes me feel like this is going to be like Nioh, but with more verticality, and minus a lot of the things that irritated me about Nioh. So, Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice. You look great. You look great. Have you done something with your hair? Is that a new katana? Super Meat Boy Forever. I don't know that I'm necessarily super excited about more meat, but it has been a long time since Meat Boy came out. That game is one of the all-time greatest platformers, just period. I don't know if it will have enough to hook me. Time might have passed that by. Like, the window for a sequel to Super Meat Boy was, like, the ideal window anyway, was probably like 3 or 4 years ago. That being said, it looks good. It looks interesting. I love the two people who make up Team Meat. I'm really looking forward to that. I don't know when it's going to release, but on a related note, I'm really looking forward to the game. I believe it's called The Legend of Bumbo, which is the next game from half of Team Meat. And I'm blanking on his name right now. I'm sure I'll remember it in like 2 minutes, but I'm going to blame that forgetfulness on my cold, addled brain and move on. Another game I'm really looking forward to, and I'm realizing I have a lot of strategy titles on my list, which is at least an interesting point. Phoenix Point. Haha, see what I did there with points? I'm disappointed in myself. You don't need to tweet at me that you're disappointed in me. I'm disappointed in myself. It's basically XCOM, but instead of aliens, you're fighting eldritch entities, and you have to deal with different factions in kind of a post-apocalyptic society. And I have been keeping tabs on this game for a while, and it might be a little rough around the edges, but it's also being made by Julian Gollop, who is famous for creating the original XCOM, and I'm here for it. I think it could be really, really great. So, looking forward to that. There's Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. This might be one of the more eyebrow-raising ones on my list, but I played the crap out of Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles when it first released on the GameCube. And one of the major downsides of that game is, at least on GameCube, like, there was no internet really to speak of, so you couldn't, like... I shouldn't say that. Maybe there was a way to, like, jury-rig a GameCube online. I never knew anyone who ever did that. That being said, the ability to play online with friends might drastically change the experience of Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. And I'm kind of, like, the core of that game, there's, like, a lot of really good and interesting ideas there, which I'm really excited to see them revisit. They might not overhaul the entire thing, they might not give it, like, this revolutionary story, but it's probably really good. I enjoyed it, and granted, I have not returned to it since the GameCube days, so it could just be a trash fire that's a cheap cash grab, but at the same time, I do want to replay it and see if there was something there. Fire Emblem Three Houses, continuing the games that I'm excited for that are also strategy games. It's not even the last one on the list that I'm going to talk about. I love Fire Emblem, and it's a good strategy game series, and I think probably one of the best franchises that Nintendo has going for it right now. One of the few franchises that is actually oriented around storytelling, which is an interesting thing to note. And so far, I think they've been doing pretty okay with the stories. So I'm looking forward to this one. Also, it looks like they finally made their 3D models for their major releases not look like absolute eyesores. So that's a major plus. Sea of Solitude. Small indie game. It was pretty much the only thing EA showed at E3 last year that looked remotely interesting. And it just looks really good. It combines like zombies and like Wind Waker and crafting, and it looks fascinating. I'm hoping it doesn't end up being the next oh gosh, what was that game? I'm hoping it doesn't end up being the next Rime, where it keeps getting delayed and delayed for like 5 years, because I'd like to get my hands on it this year. The second game from Don't Nod on this list, the first one being Life is Strange 2, is Twin Mirror, which is like an adult mystery adventure game where you're trying to solve murders, I think. And there's also supernatural stuff going on, which just sounds really great, especially from Don't Nod. They at the very least make interesting games, even if they might have narrative problems or the mechanics aren't fully delivered on. They make very interesting games. I'm super excited for Twin Mirror. I wouldn't be surprised if this got pushed back into 2020 just because there's no solid release window for it. And it's just kind of, it seems like the kind of game that's really ambitious and probably won't be coming out this year. That's all. I guess that's all I'm trying to say. This one, I think, might have fallen off a lot of people's radars, but Indivisible, an action RPG, it just absolutely gorgeous. It was kickstarted several years ago, and it just looks really good. I love that style of animation. I love just how interesting and gripping it appears to be, and I'm getting, oddly enough, some Paper Mario style vibes, which isn't a bad thing at all. I love the combat system in most of the Mario RPG games, and yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing a fully completed Indivisible, because I think it got a demo in 2014 or 2015, and it was a pretty well-received one, so that will be rad to finally see out in the wild. The last strategy title on this list, I promise. Wasteland 3. Wasteland 2 had a lot of problems. Notably, there was just a really weird mission that involved rape victims that was not well done, and I called that out in my review. But the bones of the game were good, and it had a lot of really interesting ideas, and it was a very ambitious RPG. And the sequel to that, I can only imagine, is going to get more bananas, more interesting, and I'm here for kind of a resurrection of old school Fallout, because the Fallout we get from Bethesda has really departed from the original two Fallout games, and Wasteland 3 is kind of carrying that torch, keeping it alive, keeping that strange blend of sci-fi, retro futurism, and just like bringing it forward into a really deep RPG future. So yeah, Wasteland 3 looks really cool. And I'm gonna round this off by talking a little bit about Tunic, which was a game that I last saw, I think, 2 E3s ago. It's basically like a Legend of Zelda game, except old school Legend of Zelda, so kind of a top-down isometric view that is it's just gorgeous to look at. It is very, very pretty. The main protagonist is a cute fox, and you run around this beautiful world, solving puzzles, going on adventures, and it looks just delightful. So I'm hoping that finally comes out this year. It's another one I wouldn't be surprised to see delayed to 2020, but it just looks so good and cute and pure. So those are the games I'm really excited about coming up in 2019. Hopefully, fingers crossed. Now we kind of get to this other episode, other flip side of the suggestions that were made, and I'm going to give 5 games that really inspired me to get into games, writing about games. I'm just going to say writing about games because journalist doesn't really seem like it fits. Like, I do interview a number of people. I do write a lot about games. I write a lot of news about games. But I prefer critiquing them, and I guess I also do this podcast about video games, and I don't know, it's a lot of hats to wear. So what got me into writing about video games? So I did not start out thinking that that's what I wanted to do with my life. I initially started and I wanted to make my own games. I had ideas for a lot of different things that I wanted to do in video games. I still have a lot of ideas that I would love to make happen in video games. Part of the big problem with actually making those things happen is it takes time and money and effort and skills that I don't have. So I would also have to expend time and effort to get those skills. And that's a lot of time and effort that I have put towards other things like transitioning and making these podcasts. But I will say that at least part of my game creation itch is scratched by designing these Dungeons and Dragons campaigns that I've been running on the Best Games Period, the Dragon Guard sub-podcast, as well as We Wanted Adventurers, my other podcast that I DM. And those have been really fun and creative outlets for that little game designer inside of me that learned in high school that I am just abysmal at coding. You kind of really need to have some degree of skill in coding to at least understand it, and I don't have a lot of that innate natural talent for that. However, I do like to tell a story where I taught myself very basic Python programming over the course of a weekend. It was a lot of work that one weekend on Python. I didn't sleep. But I ended up making like a really short adventure game in Python. It was a text adventure, nothing fancy. And it was really fun. I think at the time it wasn't what I wanted to do with game design, so I got frustrated and I stopped. But I have been thinking more and more about getting into Twine and learning how to use Twine to create a branching narrative of some kind, and whether that would become a visual novel or if I just programmed it entirely as a text adventure. I think that could be really fun and interesting, just and creatively fulfilling for me. That's a huge tangent. I'm sorry. Getting back to the games that inspired me to do this. So for a long time, my dream was to make my own games. And then I found out I couldn't do that. And so I figured that the next best thing would be to write about games or write game narratives themselves. And so I just started doing that in my spare time. And I think there are a lot of games that inspired me to start doing that. And that eventually ended up in a career of some kind. I freelance all over the place. But that's a very roundabout way of explaining that for me, a lot of my formative games, I guess, in regards to what made me want to write about them, were games that I played in high school, kind of towards the tail end of high school. And so they're not as retro as you might expect, even though I've been playing games since the Super Nintendo. I was raised on Nintendo and Super Nintendo games. And so with that caveat in place, I think one of the most influential games for me was Braid, because I played Braid around the time when I was becoming conscious of how, like, analysis of art worked and different lenses and critiques you can apply to different pieces of art. And honestly, like, I don't have a ton of marketable skills or that can really make me money. One of the things I'm pretty good at is analysis and writing and being able to explain that analysis. At least I think so. I think those are two of my biggest strengths. So Braid is a really interesting beast if you take that into account, because it's basically this really abstract piece of art that plays with the tropes of the platforming genre and plays with different puzzle mechanics and does these really interesting things, all while implying a number of different stories in the background and having some very opaque, I guess, dialogue in memories. And it's all interesting. It all hints at this larger picture, and what that larger picture might be changes depending on the lens that you're applying to the game. So that became one that my brain just latched onto and thought about ad nauseum. I even wrote a paper. I think it got, if not a perfect score, it got an A in my college level writing class in high school about Braid and art and meaning. And I think that's when I really sat down and I applied myself to write about this game that had just been on my mind and explaining essentially why it had been on my mind. That was a moment where I was like, hey, I know people. I get Game Informer magazine. I read websites. Maybe I could do this and get money for it, and or help people understand what makes games resonate with them, what makes games important. So Braid played a huge part in that, I think. Kind of moving backwards, definitely I have to give some credit to Super Mario World. That's the first video game that I remember beating as a kid. And I don't know if you've gone back and played that game recently, but it is just a delight. It's gorgeous. It has just a great soundtrack. And it perfectly encapsulates, I think, and I think this is part of the staying power of Mario, but it encapsulates a world that is impossible. And that impossibility and being able to play around within it's captivating. It's interesting. It's well realized. You can imagine being in these different worlds and what they would be like and what the monsters would be like and Koopa, because everything has personality. And I kind of mean that literally. Like, the mountains have smiley faces on them. There are different inanimate objects with faces. The monsters all seem to have their own goals and agendas and personalities. Heck, even going through the credits of the game, they all get named, which is great. And I think Super Mario World really helped me fall in love with games and what games could be, and seeing, I'm projecting an awful lot onto past me, I think, with this one, but like seeing the difference between Super Mario Brothers 3 and Super Mario World, it's a huge leap in technology. And I think that might have been at least planting the seeds for me to realize that games were something really special. And this is something I think about a lot. Video games, we are privileged to live in an age of video games. Like all generations have art forms that are evolving, whether it's the artistic stylings of the painting world, or different methods of creating clay sculpture, or sculpting in general. But I think video games in particular have seen such a revolution when it comes to technology and what we can do. It's incredible. And I don't know where that stopping point is, but VR is now hinting at just a completely new future of what games could be. And that is just so interesting to me. I feel really lucky that I live at this time where I can see this evolution happen with my own eyes and experience it and write about it and be in awe of it and experience it. So many art forms have been established. Like, okay, yeah, like there are small revolutions in painting, but also people have been painting for thousands of years. People have been making sculpture for thousands of years. People could only make video games for the last 50 years. Like, put that up against most other art forms. Even film has had double the amount of time that video games have had to come into its own. And that's pretty... I think that's pretty freaking incredible. And so I think Super Mario World deserves some of that credit for showing me that technological skip and the impact that has had. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Shadow of the Colossus. That was another game similar to Braid that had a lot going on, but I think for me, that game is much less abstract than Braid. It has a much clearer look at the structure and narrative, and I think that makes it... Sorry for the snot. But that makes it a really good almost introduction to breaking down games, because the design of the game itself is very much in line with what Ico did, where it stripped away a ton of the conventions of what we expected from an action puzzle game, and Shadow of the Colossus stripped out so much of what we expect from this sprawling adventure narrative and did so many interesting things while still maintaining very clear sections of story and structure that it's easy to get into breaking it down and analyzing it and talking about it. And I think for an adolescent me, that was really, really attractive. And obviously, as time has gone on, as I have talked about in past episodes, my love and appreciation for that game has changed and undergone different metamorphoses. But for the purposes of this list, it was a really good introduction to show me that Braid wasn't an isolated thing, or at least I can't remember which one I played first. I might have played Braid second, but in either case, it was it was one of the points in the data that I was gathering that said, hey, there's more going on to these games than just having fun and feeling good. Games can do more than that. And I think Braid covered that up a little bit. But Shadow of the Colossus really ripped that open, saying, and at the time, I guess it was a little bit revolutionary, but there's more to video games than feeling good, because that game guilt trips the heck out of you and then ends on just this head-scratching, not satisfying conclusion. And it's fantastic. And so wanting to dig more into what games are was really spurred by the realization that games were more than just these entertainment boxes, and that they could have important things to say. And speaking of entertainment boxes, I am going to nominate Skies of Arcadia also as a game that really made me want to dig into games, because it was a game that fundamentally had this sprawling and hopeful narrative about adventure, and it really captures something that I love to see in video games, and that I've seen bits and pieces of repeated in other games, but really embracing that we can do anything in games. Like, it doesn't have to be crazy, super special lasers. We can have games about sky pirates riding ships, just wooden ships that fly around with traditional sails. They just fly through the sky. That's a really cool idea. And then adding pirates to the mix and having really interesting turn-based combat that wasn't afraid to take risks. And when I say that, I am talking about the turn-based combat in Skies of Arcadia, which is fairly traditional for a JRPG. Like, I'm not saying that's the revolutionary part, but the actual sky ship battles, I would play an entire game based around that combat system. And it's phenomenal and cinematic and interesting, and I've never seen anything like it ever again. And I think that really opened up my eyes to, oh, you can have an established genre of games, and you can think you know how it works because you are familiar with the genre, but part of what makes it interesting or elevates it or whatever is the fact that game developers are now being able... I'm mixing up my words. Game developers are now able to play around with expectations, and they've been able to do that for a long time. Going back and playing Final Fantasy IX, that game has excellent structure to its turn-based battles. Some of the best I've ever seen in an RPG. But seeing that you could do different things, even within a very somewhat generic JRPG, that completely alter how the game feels and is perceived, and while having, this fun adventure and delivering on these things that we don't get to see even in films. Like, I've never seen a film about sky pirates riding... Like, the closest thing you can think of is, like, Pirates of the Caribbean. And that's not about sky pirates. I'm sorry, but the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise would have been exponentially improved if they were sky pirates. Just throwing that out there. But yeah, Skies of Arcadia, excellent game. And I think one of the formative JRPGs of my adolescence. Just because I had not really been exposed to a ton of them before. I didn't play a ton of them on Super Nintendo. I didn't have a PS1, so I missed out on a ton of those games, the Final Fantasies. I had an N64, and the best RPG I played on the N64 was Quest 64, which that's a pretty terrible game. I've tried to go back and play it. I cannot even comprehend how the combat system works in that game. It is a mess. Anyway, and I think that the last one definitely has to be Mass Effect. Like, I could go with the Knights of the Old Republic games or something like that, but Mass Effect, I think, was a perfect crystallization of video games being distinct from a known property like Star Wars, being able to compete in a visually interesting manner with things like, television and movies, and delivering this really interesting and incredibly in-depth sci-fi premise of adventure. I've gone through and I've read the bios of every single planet in Mass Effect. I had a lot of time on my hands back then. But it was just because this world was so interesting and big, and I wanted to experience this universe. And the idea that Mass Effect was just the first of what would become many games that could present these interesting scenarios in visually palatable and interesting ways that were accessible to someone who cared about cinema and cinematography and framing and acting. That was really, really cool. And I wanted to be a part of that. In some way. And like, I know I'm probably not equipped to be a writer at BioWare. I wish I was, and some of the effort that I expend on my personal projects that never see the light of day is towards something like that end. I think that would be really, really fun to get to come up with backstories for items and NPCs, and like that's basically what I do for We Wanted Adventurers and Dragon Guard. Like, I sit and I spend hours writing up stuff about characters and items that never get interacted with by the players, but I know it. And if I can't be directly a part of that world, then I want to be someone who, from the outside looking in, can understand and interpret that world for other people. And I think there's some value to that. Some value to being able to articulate why people like the things that are good. And explain why sometimes the messaging in something like a Mass Effect or a Skies of Arcadia could be really problematic. Because there are a lot of little elements in stories, little throwaway gags that if you're not really paying attention and you're not really, deconstructing the story as you go or really digging into the narrative, you can completely miss. One of the things that I bring up is the way Assassin's Creed Odyssey treats its LGBT characters. And one of the things that people point to it and say, "Oh, Assassin's Creed Odyssey is really supportive of LGBT people because you can make your character gay, and there are romanceable options." But none of those romances really go anywhere. Like, some of the best romances in the game just become a small stat boost for your ship once you're done. And that person is never mentioned again and never brought up again, and you just move on to maybe a different island where maybe there's a different romanceable character, but that character doesn't matter to the story. In fact, the only time that sexuality matters to the story of Assassin's Creed Odyssey is when it can use it as the butt of weird and offensive jokes. Like the one flamboyantly gay man in the cast that recurs. I can't remember his name. It might be Archibaldes. That doesn't sound right. But one of his introductory jokes is that he's having an orgy and a goat is part of the orgy, and it's implied that he had sex with the goat. And that's not cool. Like, if you break that down, there are a lot of stereotypes that go into that and harmful ideas. And that doesn't mean the entire game is garbage. But, with that additional context in mind, well, suddenly it makes a whole lot more sense that the developers are willing to be like, hey, the character you played as gay suddenly has a kid in the DLC, and it's because they were essentially forced to have sex with a member of the opposite sex, and that's not a good look. That's not cool. And so once you start breaking it down and looking at things more intently, I think that there's a lot of value in that for both good and pointing out things that are good, which is kind of what I tried to do, and also pointing out things that are potentially perpetuating harmful ideas or attitudes that if you're just passively absorbing the story, you might take in without thinking or recognizing that that's a problem. And I think recognizing that it's a problem that's a small step towards maybe some introspection about yourself and figuring out, what your actual ideas are about the things that you enjoy or the stories you think matter. So those are the sorry to, if you're a big fan of Assassin's Creed Odyssey, sorry to point fingers at that game. There are probably better examples out there. That's just the first one that came to mind. So yeah, that's kind of all I got. And I feel like I just talked for a really long time, even with the snot breaks. So I really hope you enjoyed listening to me waffle on about video games and such. I am going to stop recording this and start editing it as soon as I can to try and get it out. It'll probably be very lightly edited, but I am really glad that you tuned in to listen on the live stream, and also that there was some interaction to get this episode out, because I was really just kind of sitting there thinking, I have no idea what I'm gonna record today. I probably would have ended up recording something about Ace Combat 7, but I like the idea of doing that as a live stream better, so I can interact with all of you and such. So on that note, you can find us on patreon.com/bestgamesperiod, and you can also find us on Twitter at bestgamesperiod, where you get updates about the show, like this live stream. And you can also find us on Extra Life, community.extra-life.org, actually. And if you haven't heard of Extra Life, it's a fantastic charity that helps sick and injured kids all across the United States and Canada. And you can sign up for it by going over to extra-life.org. And when you sign up, you can choose which Children's Miracle Network hospital you want to support, and 100% of everything you raise goes directly to that hospital to help sick and injured kids. It's really great. And you raise that money not by running a 5K for charity or whatever, but by playing games. Get a bunch of your friends together, have a $10 buy-in, $5 buy-in, whatever, and you just raised that much money to help sick and injured kids by having a game night or streaming games on Twitch or, doing stuff like that. And I think that's an awesome way for the gaming community to continue the spirit that we saw going towards Mermaids on H-Bomber Guy's stream. We can continue doing good, and we can have fun while doing that good. So again, head over to extra-life to learn, extra-life.org to learn more. And thank you for listening so much. I really appreciate it. Hope you all have a great day, and we'll see you on the Flippity Dippity.